The morning I finally trusted myself again, I was standing in a parking lot outside a grocery store in the cold, hands shaking, reading a text message I had sent 3 weeks earlier. Just a text, 7 words. Diane, the family dinner is September 14th. Sent at 9:47 in the morning. A Tuesday. I remembered because I had been sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of Earl Grey, watching a cardinal land on Frank's old bird feeder, thinking how he would have loved that. I stood there in that parking lot with the November wind cutting through my cardigan, staring at proof on a glowing screen, proof that I had said what I knew I had said, done what I knew I had done, remembered what I knew I had remembered. And I had spent 8 months apologizing for it anyway. 8 months of, "You're right, I must have forgotten." 8 months of, "I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me lately." 8 months of lying awake at 3 in the morning, combing through my own memories like a detective at a crime scene, searching for evidence of my own unreliability. I wasn't losing my mind. I was having it taken. Let me tell you about the woman I was before all of this. Not because I need you to feel sorry for her. I don't want your pity, but because you need to know who she was before you understand what was at stake. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. Everyone calls me Ellie. I am 64 years old, and for 31 of those years, I taught 2nd grade at Ashford Elementary School in Ashford, Vermont. I know what you're thinking. 2nd grade. And yes, I will tell you the same thing I told every parent at every open house for 3 decades. 2nd grade is where children learn whether the world is a place that makes sense or a place that punishes them for being confused. It matters more than people realize. I retired 4 years ago. My husband Frank retired the year before me, and we had exactly 11 months of what I can only describe as the best ordinary life imaginable. Morning coffee on this back porch, drives through the hills when the leaves turned. Friday dinners that lasted until 10 o'clock because neither of us had anywhere to be the next morning. Then Frank had a stroke on a Wednesday afternoon in October, sitting in his armchair by the living room window. He died in that chair before the ambulance arrived. The book he'd been reading was still open in his lap, a biography of Eisenhower. He had dog-eared a page. I kept the book on the nightstand for 2 years. I still haven't moved it. Grief does strange things to time. Some mornings I wake up, and the 5 years since Frank died feel like a long, manageable road I've been walking steadily. Other mornings I reach for the coffee mug on his side of the counter, and the loss is so immediate it has weight, like something physical pressing against my sternum. But I want to be clear. I was not falling apart. I was widowed, not broken. There is a difference. I kept my routines. Every Tuesday morning I ran a free reading group at the Ashford Public Library. 4 adults working toward their GED, 2 women who had never had the chance to finish school, 1 man named Roy who was 71 and had decided, as he put it, that it was embarrassing to have lived this long and never read a whole book. I drove myself everywhere. I maintained the house. I paid my bills on time, the way Frank and I had done for 35 years without a single late notice. Every Saturday morning I baked blueberry muffins and walked them across the street to my neighbor Ruth Calloway, who was 78 and lived alone and whose eyes lit up the same way every single week, as if muffins were something she never expected. We would sit in her kitchen for an hour and argue about whatever we'd both been reading. Ruth had opinions about everything and was wrong about half of it, and I loved her for both. My closest friend from university, Margaret Okafor, called every few months from Cincinnati. We had known each other for 42 years, the kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance because it's built on something structural. She always knew when something was wrong before I said a word, and I kept my journal. Frank had given me this habit early in our marriage. Write it down, he used to say, and it becomes real. Don't write it down and it just evaporates. I filled one composition notebook every 3 or 4 months. 30 years of them lined a shelf in my study. My whole life, documented in my own handwriting. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand something. I was a woman with a clear mind, a good memory, an established life, and 40 years of receipts proving it. And it still happened to me. My daughter Diane was 38 when this began. She is beautiful in the way that makes people underestimate her. That particular combination of warmth and precision that reads as approachable until you realize, usually too late, that she has already made 3 calculations you weren't aware of. She worked as a project manager for a consulting firm in Burlington. She was good at it. She had always been good at organizing things, systems, schedules, other people's lives. As a child, she color-coded her school binders. As a teenager, she kept a planner that would have impressed a CEO. I used to joke that she had been born knowing how to optimize. Her husband Greg was 41, quieter, the kind of man who stands in doorways at parties rather than entering rooms. He had a steadiness I had always appreciated. He was good to her. He was good to the children. Their children, my grandchildren, were Jake, who was 9, and Sophie, who was 6. Jake was all elbows and encyclopedic knowledge about dinosaurs. Sophie was the kind of 6-year-old who still climbed into your lap without being invited and fell asleep there like a cat. I adored them in a way that surprised me every time. That particular grandparent love that is somehow both deeper and lighter than the love you have for your own children. Diane and her family lived 40 minutes away, in a house that was slightly too large for what they needed and slightly too expensive for what they earned, which I knew because Diane had told me, in the way she told me many things, with a combination of complaint and calculation that I had learned over the years to listen to carefully. We were close. That is the important thing to understand. We spoke every day. She brought the children to see me most weekends. When Frank died, she was the one who stayed for a week, who handled the calls, who sat with me in the evenings when the house got too quiet. I was grateful. I am still grateful for that, whatever came after. She was my daughter, and I loved her, and I did not see what was coming. The first thing happened on a Thursday in February, and it was so small that I didn't recognize it as a thing at all. I had spent that morning doing what I always did. Library group, grocery stop, home by noon. I made soup and ate it standing at the counter reading the newspaper. In the afternoon, I sorted through a box of Frank's old paperwork I'd been meaning to deal with for 2 years. His brown tweed overcoat was hanging on the hook by the back door, where it had been since October, and I kept catching sight of it from the kitchen. It smelled like him, cedar, and something slightly sweet I never could identify. I had held it against my face more times than I would tell anyone. Diane came by that evening for dinner. We ate pasta, and she told me about a project at work running over deadline, and I told her about Roy, who had just finished reading The Old Man and the Sea and announced it was sad but not wasteful, which I thought was the best review of Hemingway I'd ever heard. After dinner, she helped clear the table, and at some point she paused by the back door. "Oh, you decided to keep it," she said. "Keep what?" "Dad's coat." She was looking at the tweed. "I thought you were going to donate it. You said keeping it was making you sad every time you saw it." I turned from the sink. "I never said that." She looked at me with a small, patient expression I hadn't seen on her before. "Mom, you did. Last month, when I was here. You said keeping it was making it harder to move on. You asked me to remind you to take it to Goodwill." I stood very still. I thought back through every conversation I could recall. "I don't remember saying that." "I know," she said it gently. "That's kind of what I'm saying. I did not donate the coat. But for 3 days afterward, I turned the conversation over in my mind, the way you probe a sore tooth with your tongue. Had I said it? Was there a moment, some tired evening, where I had said something like that and truly forgotten? I was 64. Were 64-year-olds supposed to start forgetting things? I decided I had probably been tired and said something careless. I put it out of my mind. I was wrong to put it out of my mind. The second thing happened 6 weeks later. I had an appointment with my doctor, James Reeves, the first Tuesday in April. Annual checkup, nothing unusual. I drove myself, arrived 5 minutes early, sat in the waiting room reading a National Geographic, the August issue, a piece about Arctic tern migration. The receptionist, a young woman named Linda, who wore her hair in 2 braids and had a small sunflower tattoo on her wrist, called my name at 9:10. "Doctor, Reeves checked everything, said my blood pressure was excellent, told me to keep doing whatever I was doing, and sent me on my way. I stopped at the bakery 2 doors down and bought myself a scone. Blueberry, because that morning I was out of the fresh kind. I ate it in the car. I should mention, somewhere around this time, Diane had helped me switch to a new phone. This one's so much easier, Mom. The font is bigger, the camera is better, your contacts transfer automatically. I had dropped the old phone into a zippered pouch in my desk drawer and barely thought about it again. I couldn't find the charger for it anyway. 2 weeks after my appointment, Diane called on a Sunday afternoon. "Mom, Dr. Reeves' office called me." "Why would they call you?" "You have me listed as your emergency contact." The receptionist said you missed your appointment in April. She said it's the second time. I set down the book I'd been reading. I didn't miss it. I was there. A careful pause. Are you sure? Diane. I sat in that waiting room. I read an article about Arctic terns. Linda called my name. Dr. Reeves checked my blood pressure. Okay. The word had a texture to it. Not disbelief, but something adjacent. A kind of suspended judgment. I'll call them back and sort it out. I'm sure it's just an administrative thing. She called back an hour later. They couldn't find the record on their end. They're going to look into it. But Mom, just to be safe, maybe I should start coming with you to appointments? Just to help keep track. I don't need help keeping track, I said. I went. I know. I'm just saying, as an option. I called the office myself the next morning. The woman who answered was not Linda. She said she'd have to pull the records and call me back. She never did. I called again. Different person. Apologetic. I'll leave a note for the office manager. I never got a return call. And here is what I need you to understand about that. Not the appointment, not the missing record, but this. I, Eleanor Hartwell, who had managed every element of my own life for 64 years without assistance, found myself unable to prove I had kept a doctor's appointment. For the first time, I felt afraid of myself. Not of Diane, not of anything external, of myself, of the inside of my own head. That was the point. I understand that now. The third thing was the one that cut deepest, though I didn't show it. In May, I ran into Ruth on a Wednesday afternoon. Not our usual Saturday, just a coincidence on the sidewalk outside the post office. We walked together for a bit, and Ruth was warm, but there was something slightly off in how she looked at me. A softness that was different from her usual directness. Are you doing all right? She asked. Really? Of course, I said. Why? She hesitated in the way people do when they've been told something they don't know whether to repeat. Diane mentioned you've been a little scattered lately. I just wanted you to know that if you ever need anything... Scattered, I repeated. She said you've been forgetting things, missing things. Ruth touched my arm. There's no shame in it, Ellie. It happens. I stood on that sidewalk and smiled and said something about being tired and the adjustment of retirement, and Ruth squeezed my hand and told me I was wonderful, and I walked to my car and sat in it for 10 minutes without starting the engine. In May, I had put a birthday card and 2 crisp $50 bills in an envelope and handed it to Jake myself, watched him tear it open on the front porch, watched his face go wide with the particular delight that only money produces in a 9-year-old boy. He had thrown his arms around my neck and said, Grandma, you're the best one. I had not forgotten Jake's birthday. I had not forgotten anything. My daughter had told my closest neighbor that I had. That same week, I went to reach for my journal, the current one, September through the present, and couldn't find it on the desk where I always kept it. I searched the study, searched the bedroom, checked every room in the house with the methodical patience of someone who has learned not to panic. 3 days later, I found it wedged behind the bottom shelf of the living room bookcase, near the floor, in the narrow gap between the shelf and the wall. I pulled it out and stood there turning it in my hands. I did not put it there. I had never in 30 years of journaling put a current notebook anywhere but my desk. I opened it to the last entry. The final 3 pages had been torn out, clean along the binding. Recent entries, I could see the indentations of my own handwriting ghosted onto the remaining pages, pressed through from the removed ones. I stood in my living room holding that journal and said nothing to the empty house. I thought about Frank, about what he would have said. Write it down, Ellie. Make it real. I went to my desk and opened a new notebook. I wrote the date at the top of the first page, and I began to keep a different kind of record. If this sounds familiar, if you are reading this and recognizing something you've lived through or are living through right now, I want you to hear this clearly. The confusion you feel is not a flaw in you. It was put there. And knowing that is the first thing. Not the last, just the first. Stay with me. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. I know what tired feels like. The good kind. The kind Frank and I used to feel on Sunday evenings after a full weekend. Pleasantly worn down, ready for Monday. I know what grief-tired feels like. the heavy, waterlogged fatigue of loss that sits in your bones for months. This was neither of those things. This was the exhaustion of constant self-surveillance, of monitoring your own mind the way you'd monitor an appliance that had started making an unfamiliar sound. Not broken yet, but possibly about to be, and you couldn't stop listening for it. By June, I was checking things twice, then 3 times. I wrote down appointments the moment I made them. I photographed my mail before opening it. I kept receipts for everything, stuffed into an envelope in my desk drawer, because at some point I had started understanding, without fully articulating it to myself, that I might need to prove ordinary things. I told myself this was just being careful, just organized, just sensible. I did not yet have a word for what was happening to me. What I lost first was the small things, not memories. Those stayed intact, sharp and detailed as they had always been. What I lost was my willingness to speak them. At the Tuesday library group, I had always been the one with stories. I'd tell Roy about a book I'd read that connected to whatever he was working through. I'd find the thread between someone's struggle on the page and something real and human and encouraging. Words had always come easily to me. 31 years in a classroom will do that. But sometime in June, I started hesitating mid-sentence. Not because I'd forgotten what I was saying, because I'd begun to doubt the details before I'd even finished delivering them. Was it Tuesday or Wednesday? Was the author's name Morrison or Morehouse? Am I about to say something wrong? Roy noticed first, the way quiet people often notice things the rest of us miss. Mrs. H., he said one morning, using the name my second graders had called me, which he'd adopted somewhere along the way. You stopped before the end of that story. Was there more? I just wasn't sure I had it right, I said. He looked at me with the particular gravity of a 71-year-old man who has survived enough to recognize unnecessary apology. You always have it right, he said simply, and went back to his page. I drove home that morning with his words sitting in the passenger seat, like something fragile. What I lost second was my Saturday mornings with Ruth. Not the friendship itself. Ruth was too stubborn for that. But I stopped going, stopped making the muffins. Told myself it was because I'd been busy, tired, not feeling up to it. The truth was simpler and harder. I was ashamed. Diane had told Ruth I was scattered. Ruth had looked at me on that sidewalk with soft, worried eyes, and I could not sit in Ruth's kitchen drinking coffee and recommending novels and arguing about things when I knew that somewhere underneath Ruth's warmth was a question about my reliability, a question my own daughter had planted there. So I stayed home on Saturdays, drank my Earl Grey alone, watched the cardinal at the feeder and did not call anyone. I would think of Ruth sometimes. Wonder if she noticed the empty Saturdays. Wonder what she made of my absence. I told myself she was probably relieved not to have to manage her concern for me every week. I understand now that this thought, too, had been planted. This, I know now, was exactly what was supposed to happen. Isolation doesn't always arrive with locked doors. Sometimes it arrives with small embarrassments, with reasons you construct yourself, out of borrowed shame, to stay inside. The control expanded quietly, the way water moves. One evening in late June, Diane sat across from me at my own kitchen table with her laptop open and a look of careful concern arranged on her face. "Mom, I want to talk to you about something practical." I set down my tea. "All right. I was looking at your accounts, just checking in, you know how I worry, and I noticed the electric bill was almost late last month." I kept my voice even. "Almost late isn't late, but it was close, and I know you have a lot to manage on your own." She turned the laptop toward me. "I was thinking, what if we just set up automatic payments? I can link your checking account and handle it from my end. You wouldn't have to think about it." I looked at the screen. A bank interface, already half filled in. "I've managed my own bills for 35 years without a late notice," I said. "I know you have. I'm not saying you haven't." The careful voice, the patient voice, the voice that made disagreement feel like aggression. "I'm just saying things pile up, and with Dad gone, there's no one here to catch the little things. Let me help. It would make me feel better." There it was. It would make me feel better. Turning my autonomy into something that could cause her distress if I kept it. I should have said no. I want to be honest with you about that. I should have said no. But I was 6 months into doubting my own memory, 3 months into being ashamed in front of my closest friend. and I was tired in the way I told you about at the beginning of this section. The kind of tired that makes reasonable people agree to unreasonable things just to have one less source of friction. Fine, I said. Just the utilities. She smiled and typed something and closed the laptop. This is good, Mom. This is practical. I nodded and picked up my tea and looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard and felt, without being able to name it yet, that I had just handed something over. Greg spoke to me alone for the first time in July. Diane was upstairs with the children. Bath time. The familiar chaos of it drifting down through the ceiling. Greg and I sat in the living room with the comfortable silence of two people who have always gotten along without needing to perform it. Then he leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Something deliberate, something prepared. Ellie, can I say something, man to man? Well, he smiled slightly at himself. You know what I mean. Go ahead. Diane worries about you, more than she lets on. He paused. She cried about it last week, just lying in bed, crying quietly, because she doesn't want to lose you the way she lost Frank. Suddenly, without warning. I was quiet for a moment. I'm not sick, Greg. I know, but she doesn't know that. She sees things that concern her. He sat back. I'm not trying to pressure you. I just thought you should know how much this weighs on her. I thanked him for telling me. I meant it, in the way you can mean something that is also being used against you. After he went upstairs, I sat in the living room for a while. The lamp made a warm circle on the ceiling. Frank's biography of Eisenhower was still on the nightstand upstairs, dog-eared at the page where he'd stopped. She cries about it at night. I felt guilty. That was the design. I understand that now. But understanding the design does not make the guilt retroactive, does not undo the weeks I spent trying to be less of a burden to a daughter who was manufacturing the burden herself. Then I heard the word transition. It was a Thursday evening in August. Diane had come for dinner and the children were in the backyard and Greg was somewhere. I thought he'd gone to the car for something. Diane was in the kitchen and I was in the hallway, about to come in, when I heard her voice. She was on the phone. The back door was open. Evening light on the kitchen floor. If we can show she's not managing well, the transition will be smoother. Greg, just trust me on the timing. A pause. Her voice lower, but not low enough. No, I know. But these things take time to establish. You can't rush the documentation. I stood in the hallway and did not move. Documentation. Transition. I did not understand the full architecture of what I was hearing. I want to be honest about that. I did not stand in that hallway and see clearly to the end. I just heard two words that lodged themselves somewhere deep and quiet inside me, the way a splinter works its way inward before you know it's there. I went back to the living room and sat down. When Diane came out of the kitchen a few minutes later, she was herself again. Easy, warm, talking about the children's school schedules. I smiled and passed the bread and said nothing. But I kept those words. I put them somewhere safe. The dinner was in September. Diane had suggested it. A small family get-together, nothing fancy, and she had invited Patricia. Aunt Patricia was Frank's younger sister, 70 years old, sharp as a tack. The kind of woman who wore her white hair like a statement and had an opinion about every book ever written. She and I had been close for 35 years. Closer, if I'm honest, after Frank died. The two of us keeping each other tethered to him through shared memory. Patricia's presence that evening should have felt like ballast. It felt instead like it had been calculated. We sat around my dining room table, Diane, Greg, Patricia, myself, the children eating quickly before being excused. The food was good. The conversation was easy for the first hour, and then Diane began telling a story about Frank. It was the story of the summer he took her fishing for the first time. A good story. I had heard it and told it myself, many times. But she placed it in the wrong year. It was the summer of '89, she said. Dad always talked about that trip. '87, I said automatically. We'd just gotten back from visiting my mother in Portland. Frank's old friend Jake had lent him the fishing gear because ours was still packed. Diane glanced across the table. Mom, it was '89. I was there. You were 4 in 1987. You were there for both, but the fishing trip was '87. I remember it clearly. So do I. I kept my voice steady. I have a photo dated that summer. Frank's wearing his red flannel. There was a brief silence, one of those silences that has a shape. Then Diane turned to Patricia with a small, concerned tilt of her head, so practiced, so smooth, and said, "She does this a lot lately. We've been a little worried." Patricia looked at me, not with suspicion, not with the sharpness I'd known in her for 35 years, with something softer, something that had already been bent. "It's all right, Eleanor," she said gently, touching my hand across the table. "These things happen. These things happen." As if I had already been filed, as if the question had been settled before I sat down. I looked around the table. Greg was looking at his plate. Sophie was drawing on a napkin. Jake glanced at me once with the quick, uncomfortable look of a child who senses something he doesn't have words for. No one looked back at me as an equal, not one person at that table. I excused myself, walked down the hallway to the small bathroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the tub and pressed my hands flat against my knees. And I cried. Not softly, not decorously, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below the throat, that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the terror of suddenly not being believed, not by others, but by the part of yourself that monitors your own reliability. What if they're right? That was the thought. That was the crack. What if I am losing myself and I simply cannot see it? What if this whole time I've been the unreliable one, and Diane has been trying to reach me, and I've been arguing with my own daughter over the year of a fishing trip while something real and frightening erodes inside me? I sat on the edge of that tub for 4 minutes. Then I washed my face with cold water, looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, dried my hands, opened the door, walked back to the table. I did not argue again that evening, but somewhere in those 4 minutes, something had shifted, something very small, below the level of conscious thought, like a compass needle that has been jostled and is slowly finding north again. I did not know it yet, but I had started to turn. September became October. I went through the motions of my days with the careful steadiness of someone who has decided not to think about something until they know how. Library group on Tuesdays, groceries, the house, the quiet evenings. I moved through each one like a woman performing her own life, waiting for something she couldn't yet name. And then Margaret came. Margaret Okafor arrived on a Friday afternoon in October without warning, which was entirely Margaret. She had been in Boston for a conference and had simply kept driving north. "I wanted to see Vermont in October," she said at the door, bag over her shoulder, not even slightly apologetic about the lack of notice. "And I wanted to see you." We sat on the back porch with tea, wrapped in blankets against the autumn cold, watching the maple at the edge of the yard flame red and orange in the late afternoon light. Margaret talked for a while, about her work, her daughter's new apartment, a neighbor's impossible dog. And then she stopped talking and looked at me for a long moment in the direct, undecorated way she'd always had. "Ellie," she said, "you seem smaller." "Smaller?" "Like someone turned the volume down on you." She tilted her head. "That's the only way I can say it. You're quieter in a way that doesn't feel like peace." "I've just been tired," I said. The answer came automatically, practiced. "You were never tired," Margaret said. "You were the loudest person in every room we were ever in together. Not loud in that way, but present. You took up your full amount of space. You're not doing that right now." I looked at the maple tree. A gust moved through it, and a small avalanche of red leaves let go. "Something's been off," I said finally. "With my memory, or people keep telling me something's off with my memory, and I've started to believe them." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does your journal say?" I looked at her. "You've kept a journal since I've known you," she said. "What does it say?" The torn pages was there, but underneath was the journal of September, the one with the torn pages, was there. But underneath it, in a zippered pouch I hadn't opened in months, was the old phone, the one Diane had helped me replace back in March. I found the charger at the back of the same drawer, still there, and plugged it in. Set the phone on the desk, sat across from it and waited. 20 minutes later, the screen lit up. I picked it up with both hands. I went to the messages, scrolled back to September. September 14th, sent at 9:47 a.m. "Diane, the family dinner is September 14th. Read 9:52 a.m. She had read it. 45 minutes after I sent it, on the morning of the day she later told me I had never mentioned. I set the phone down, picked it up again, went to the calendar. April 6th, Dr. Reeves, 9 a.m., marked attended by the automated confirmation, time-stamped. The appointment I had kept, the one the receptionist could not find, the one Diane had used to suggest I needed accompaniment. I went to the photos. Jake's birthday, May 18th. Jake on the front porch, envelope in both hands, face split wide open with the uncomplicated joy of unexpected money. My hand visible at the edge of the frame. 4:17 p.m. I sat with those photos for a long time. The house was very quiet. The refrigerator made its small sound. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the maple. I wasn't forgetting. The thought arrived without drama. No crash of revelation, no flood of anger. Just clarity, cold and clean and complete, the way winter air clarifies a landscape by stripping away everything that had been obscuring it. I was being told I was forgetting. Those are not the same thing. I opened the new notebook, the one I'd started after the torn pages, to a fresh page. At the top I wrote, "Things I know to be true," and I began to write, not to process, not to mourn. I wrote in columns, with dates, with specifics, the way Frank had always said, making things real by making them precise. The coat, the appointment, Jake's birthday, the dinner message, the torn pages, the phone call I'd overheard, documentation, transition, timing. The words scattered passed from my daughter to my neighbor. The automatic bill payments, set up on a laptop that had already been half filled in before she'd even shown it to me. Greg's careful mention of Diane crying at night. Aunt Patricia's hand on mine. These things happen. I wrote for 2 hours. When I finished, I sat back and looked at what I'd made. It was not the record of a confused woman. It was the record of a woman who had been slowly, methodically, and very deliberately made to feel confused. There is a word for this. I had encountered it before in a general way, a word that floated in cultural awareness without specific weight. That night I looked it up properly, read it carefully, read it again. Gaslighting, a form of psychological manipulation in which a person causes someone to question their own memory, perception, and sanity. I read the definition 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, folded my hands on the desk, looked at the framed photo of Frank beside the lamp. Frank at 52, squinting into the sun somewhere in Vermont, holding a fish neither of us could identify. "Write it down," he had said. "Make it real." I had written it down. It was real. I sat with that for a moment. Just sat with it, the way you sit with something you've been carrying a long time and have finally set down. And for the first time in 8 months, so was I. If someone in your life makes you doubt what you clearly remember, that is not your mind failing. That is someone else failing you. Hold that. Don't put it down. Part 3 is coming. And so is the woman she used to be. The first thing I did the next morning was call my doctor's office myself. Not to prove anything to Diane. Not yet. I called because I needed to start trusting my own instincts again. One small action at a time. And my instinct said, begin with the facts. The woman who answered was Linda. The same Linda with the braids and the sunflower tattoo. I recognized her voice. "Linda," I said. "This is Eleanor Hartwell. I was in for my annual checkup on April 6th. You called me in from the waiting room yourself." A pause, then the sound of typing. "Yes, Mrs. Hartwell. I have you right here. April 6th, 9 a.m. Dr. Reeves. Marked complete." "There was some confusion recently about whether I attended," I said carefully. "I'd like a copy of that record sent to me directly. To my home address, not to any other contact." "Of course. I can have that out today." I thanked her and hung up, sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around my mug of Earl Grey, and breathed. One fact. Confirmed. Written in someone else's records, not just my own memory. It was a small thing. It felt enormous. Margaret stayed through the weekend. We didn't talk about Diane constantly. That wasn't Margaret's way, and it wasn't mine. We cooked together, walked along the road into town, sat with our books in companionable silence the way we'd done since we were 22 years old in a university common room. But on Sunday morning, over breakfast, she said, "Have you talked to anyone? A professional?" "I hadn't thought about it," I said. "Think about it," she said simply, and poured more coffee. After she left, I sat with the idea. I had always associated therapy with crisis, with people at the edge of something. I did not feel like a person at the edge. I felt like a person who had just realized the ground beneath her had been slowly tilted for months and was now, carefully, trying to find level again. That, I decided, was reason enough. I looked for someone outside Ashford. I didn't want a therapist who might know Diane, or know of her, or run into her at the pharmacy on a Tuesday. I found a name in the next town over, Dr. Susan Aldridge, licensed clinical psychologist with an office above a hardware store on a quiet street. I called on a Monday. She had an opening on Thursday. I wrote it in my notebook. Then I photographed the page. Old habits, new purpose. Dr. Aldridge's office was small and sensible. 2 chairs, a low table, a window that looked out onto a fire escape, and beyond it, a strip of pale November sky. She was in her early 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who had heard a great many things without being rattled by any of them. I told her everything, from the coat in February to the torn journal pages, the canceled appointment, the overheard phone call, the dinner with Patricia. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Since February, about 8 months. And in that time, has anything changed in terms of your finances or legal arrangements?" I mentioned the automatic bill payments, the laptop already half filled in. "Do you know the specifics of what access she has?" I didn't, not precisely. I had agreed to just the utilities and trusted that was what it meant. Dr. Aldridge suggested gently that I review my accounts directly before our next session. I did it that evening. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and my reading glasses and opened my bank account for the first time since March. The utilities were there. Electric, water, internet, paid automatically as agreed. But there were other transactions. Transfers out. Small amounts, irregular intervals, spread across 8 months in a pattern designed to be unnoticeable if you weren't looking carefully. $4,200. I counted twice, then a third time. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I had given her access to the utilities. I had not given her access to anything else. And yet there it was. $4,200, moved out of my account in increments small enough not to trigger alarm over the 8 months since she had sat across from me with that laptop already half filled in. I did not call her that night. I opened my notebook and wrote down every transaction. Date, amount, running total. Then I wrote at the bottom of the page, "This is not a misunderstanding." And I closed the notebook and went to bed. And for the first time in months, I slept without lying awake cataloging my own failures. I was not failing. I was being robbed. Slowly, quietly, by someone who had first needed to convince me I was too confused to notice. The next Thursday, I sat across from Dr. Aldridge and told her about the $4,200. She did not look surprised. That, more than anything, told me something. "This pattern has a name," she said. "What you've been describing, the memory challenges, the social isolation, the financial access, these are documented tactics. They often occur together." "Gaslighting," I said. I looked it up. "Yes, and in cases involving older adults and family members, it frequently has a financial component." She paused. "Ellie, I want to ask you something directly. Do you feel safe?" "Physically, yes," I said. "But I don't feel secure. There's a difference." She nodded. "There is, and that distinction matters." We talked for the rest of the hour about next steps. She recommended a lawyer, someone who specialized in elder law, outside our immediate area. She recommended I speak to my bank directly and remove any access that hadn't been explicitly and formally authorized. She recommended I continue the notebook. "Document everything," she said. "Dates, times, exact words where you can remember them. Not because you'll necessarily need it in court, but because having the record will help you trust yourself when someone tries to tell you you're misremembering." I almost smiled. "I've been doing that since October." She looked at me steadily. "Good. You already knew what you needed." Step 2. Take back what is yours. The following Monday, I drove to First Valley Bank and asked to speak with the branch manager, a man named Thomas Briggs who had a firm handshake and a no-nonsense quality I found immediately reassuring. I told him I needed to review every authorization on my account and remove any access that had not been formally documented with my signature. He pulled up the records. The automatic payment setup had been done online, not in person. No signed authorization on file for anything beyond the utility accounts. And the transfer's out? I asked. He looked at the screen. His expression remained professionally neutral, but something shifted in it. I'll need to pull the full transaction history. Can you give me a few minutes? I sat in the chair across from his desk and looked out the window at the parking lot and the gray November sky and felt, running beneath everything, a steadiness I had not felt in months. When he came back, he had printed pages. He walked me through each transfer. They had been initiated through the online portal, through the same login credentials Diane had set up when she'd arranged the utility payments. I'd like to close that access entirely, I said. And I'd like a record of every transaction going back to March. Absolutely. He was already typing. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm also going to give you the name of someone, a lawyer our bank works with occasionally. He specializes in exactly these kinds of situations. His name is David Whitmore. I wrote the name down. I drove home with the printed records on the passenger seat and called David Whitmore from my kitchen before I'd even taken off my coat. Step 3. The conversation that was never going to be easy. I called Diane the next evening and asked her to come over. Alone. No Greg, no children. She arrived in that careful way she had. Measured warmth, the look of someone prepared to be patient with an unreasonable person. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd opened the half-filled laptop, where she'd told me things were practical, where she'd arranged my cooperation one gentle suggestion at a time. I put my old phone on the table between us. I want to show you something, I said. I opened the messages. September 14th, 9:47 a.m. Showed her the screen. She looked at it. 1 second. 2. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, not quite, but the involuntary response of someone whose calculation has been interrupted. Mom, that doesn't prove... I'm not asking you to admit anything, I said. I kept my voice even. I'm telling you, I know. I know about the appointment record. I know about Jake's birthday. I know what you told Ruth. I paused. And I know about the $4,200. The kitchen went very quiet. Diane's composure didn't shatter. She wasn't built for shattering. But it cracked, in the particular way of someone who has been certain of their own control and has just discovered its limits. We needed, she started. I know what you needed, I said. I'm telling you what I needed. I needed my daughter to talk to me. Not manage me, not document me. Talk to me. She looked at the table. Things are hard right now, financially. You thought I would cooperate more easily if I didn't trust myself, I said quietly. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the refrigerator, the wind outside, the distant sound of a car on the road. Then Diane said, We have 2 kids, Mom. Do you have any idea what everything costs now? The house, the school fees, just everything. Yes, I said. I raised 1 child on a teacher's salary after her father and I paid off a mortgage ourselves. I have some idea. It's different now. It is, I agreed. And if you had come to me and said, Mom, we're struggling. Can we talk about whether there's any way you can help? I would have listened. I would have tried. I looked at her directly. But that's not what you did. Her eyes were bright, but she wasn't going to cry. Diane never cried in front of people when she felt caught. You would have said no. Maybe. Or maybe I would have said yes. You didn't give me the chance to decide anything. That was the point, wasn't it? I wasn't supposed to decide. I was supposed to be maneuvered into a position where deciding wasn't possible anymore. She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, stood with her back to me, looking out at the dark yard. I didn't think it would go this far, she said finally. Her voice had changed, the management quality gone from it, something more raw underneath. Which part? I asked. She didn't answer. The money? I said. The canceled prescription you arranged last month? The cognitive appointment you booked with Dr. Morrison's office without telling me? She turned around. How did you know about that? David Whitmore is very thorough, I said. And Dr. Morrison's office called me directly when they couldn't reach you for a confirmation. The color left her face. Diane, I said, and I worked to keep my voice from being cruel, because cruelty wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what either of us needed. I am 64 years old. I am not declining. I am not confused. I am your mother, and I have been your mother for 38 years, and I needed you to see me as that. not as a problem to be managed before it became inconvenient. She sat back down at the table, not across from me this time. She pulled the chair around to the side, closer, and for a moment she looked the age she actually was, instead of the age her competence usually made her seem. "I got scared," she said. "After Dad. I got scared of losing you too, and then the financial stuff piled up, and it started as one thing and became another thing, and I just—" She stopped. "That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it's not. Are you going to press charges?" "David Whitmore is advising me on my options," I said. "What happens next depends on what you do next." 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in December, I woke up before sunrise as I always do. I made Earl Grey, stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky lighten over the yard. The maple bare now, its branches dark against the pale gray. The cardinal came to the feeder, the same one, or one just like it. I watched it for a long time. Then I got out the mixing bowl. I measured flour, sugar, baking powder. I zested a lemon. I'd started adding lemon zest the previous spring, and the change had been quietly revolutionary. I folded in the blueberries, fresh from the bag I'd bought at the market on Thursday, and slid the tin into the oven. While they baked, I sat at the table and opened my notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Not things I know to be true. Just the date. Just December. Just today. When the timer went off, I took the muffins out and let them cool on the rack by the window. The kitchen smelled of lemon and butter and something warm and ordinary and entirely mine. At 8:30, I put 6 muffins into a box, put on my coat and scarf, and walked across the street. Ruth answered the door in her housecoat, hair not yet done, reading glasses on. She looked at me, then at the box, then back at me. "Ellie," she said. "I know it's been a while," I said. "I brought muffins, and I want you to know, whatever Diane told you about me over these past months, it wasn't true. I'm sorry I wasn't here to tell you that sooner." Ruth looked at me for a long moment over the top of her glasses. Then she said, "Honey, I knew. I just didn't know how to reach you without making things worse." She took the box from my hands. "She asked me to watch for signs that you were declining. I thought it was odd. You were sharper than her every single time I saw you both together." I stood on Ruth's doorstep in the December cold with the bare maple behind me and the pale winter sky overhead, and I breathed out slowly. A long, deliberate exhale, the kind that carries something with it when it goes. "Do you want to come in?" Ruth asked. "Yes," I said. "I really do." Recovery is not a single morning. I want to be honest about that. There were days in December when I woke up and the doubt crept back in the way cold comes under a door. Not dramatically, just persistently, needing to be addressed again and again. Some mornings I sat at the table with my tea and caught myself second-guessing a memory, and I had to deliberately, consciously choose to trust it. Choose the way you choose anything. Not automatically, not easily, but intentionally. Dr. Aldridge had warned me about this. "The mind doesn't undo 8 months of conditioning in a week," she said. "Be patient with yourself." I was learning to be. Diane and I did not speak for 5 weeks after the kitchen conversation. She called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail and listened to them later, alone, replaying them in the particular way of someone gathering information rather than comfort. In the first message, she said she was sorry. In the second, she said she was getting help. She had started seeing a therapist of her own, she said, someone who was helping her understand some patterns. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She just said she was working on it. I called her back after the second message. We spoke for 20 minutes. Carefully, the way you speak across new terrain, testing each step before putting your weight on it. "The kids miss you," she said near the end. "I know. I miss them too. Would you want to see them? Just them, maybe? Jake has a science fair project he wants to show you." "Yes," I said. "I'd like that." Jake called me himself the following Sunday. He had built a model of the water cycle for his science fair and wanted to walk me through it on video call, which he did with the focused intensity of a 9-year-old who has discovered that explaining things to grandmothers is deeply satisfying. Sophie climbed into frame halfway through and announced that she had lost a tooth and that the tooth fairy had brought her $2 whole, and did I think that was fair? "I think that's extremely fair," I said. "Grandma?" Jake said once Sophie had been gently redirected. Are you okay? Mom said you were going through some stuff. I was, I said. I'm better now. Did you figure it out? I did. He considered this with the solemn practicality of a 9-year-old. Good, he said. Because you're really smart, Grandma. You always know things. I sat with that for the rest of the evening. David Whitmore and I met in January. Diane had, without being asked, returned the $4,200 in full, a wire transfer, no note attached. David confirmed that the transfer arrangement had been set up without proper written authorization, which gave me legal standing if I chose to pursue it further. I chose not to. That was my decision to make, and I made it. What I did pursue was a formal legal framework going forward, a clear, documented record of what I had authorized and what I had not, drawn up properly and filed appropriately, so that there would never again be a gap between what I agreed to and what someone else could access. Thomas Briggs at the bank was helpful. David Whitmore was excellent. I left his office in January with paperwork that meant something, and drove home through the bare Vermont winter feeling a particular kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with winning and everything to do with having closed a door properly. Roy finished his second book in January, East of Eden. He called it overwhelming in the best possible way, and we spent 20 minutes discussing whether Steinbeck was being optimistic or simply honest about human nature. And I disagreed with Roy's reading entirely and told him so, and he disagreed right back, and it was the best conversation I'd had in months. Afterward, I drove home and sat at my desk and opened the notebook. Not the evidence notebook, not the things I know to be true notebook. A new one, started in December, just a journal, the ordinary kind. I wrote about Roy and Steinbeck. I wrote about the cardinal at the feeder. I wrote about December light on the kitchen floor, and lemon zest muffins and Ruth's housecoat, and the way Sophie's gap-toothed smile looked on a small phone screen. I wrote about Frank, about how he would have handled all of this, not with rage, which wasn't his way, but with a kind of steady, unflappable clarity. Write it down, Ellie. Make it real. I wrote about what I had learned, not about Diane, not about manipulation or documentation or legal frameworks, about myself. I had learned that self-doubt, once seated in the right conditions, grows faster than almost anything. I had learned that intelligence and experience are not armor against it, that a woman who had managed a classroom full of 7-year-olds for 31 years could still be made to apologize for her own memories, given the right combination of persistence and love used as leverage. I had learned that the people most capable of this kind of damage are almost never strangers. And I had learned, slowly, imperfectly, one small certain action at a time, that you can find your way back. It is February now, February 2026. The yard is deep in snow, the maple reduced to its winter architecture, elegant and spare. I have Earl Grey at 6, and the cardinal comes most mornings, and I am writing this in the journal Frank gave me the habit of keeping. A different notebook, a new volume, but the same practice. Last Saturday I brought muffins to Ruth. We sat in her kitchen for 2 hours and argued about a novel she'd read, and I hadn't yet, and she was wrong about the ending and right about everything else, and I told her so, loudly, the way I always used to. On the drive home, I thought about what Margaret had said in October, sitting on my back porch with the maple blazing red. You seem smaller, like someone turned the volume down on you. I thought about that for a long time. Then I turned onto my street and I parked in my driveway, and I sat for a moment looking at my house. My house, the one I have maintained for 30 years, the one Frank died in, the one I have kept without assistance or guidance, the one that will be mine for as long as I choose it. I got out of the car. I was not smaller. The cruelest thing wasn't the lying. It was making me the one who stopped trusting myself. Getting that trust back. That's the real work. And I do it every single day. Not because someone gave me permission, because I am the only one who can. If this story reached something in you, if you recognized yourself or someone you love, please share it. Leave a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. You are not confused. You are not difficult. You are not declining. You are paying attention. And that matters more than anyone who benefits from your doubt will ever admit.